The cabin was supposed to be my sanctuary. After years of working brutal hours in the city as a civil engineer, I had saved up enough money to buy a piece of land tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains, far from traffic, HOA meetings, and nosy neighbors. I had grown tired of dealing with petty suburban politics, especially after living in an HOA-controlled neighborhood for almost a decade, where every mailbox had to be painted the same shade of beige and your grass could never exceed exactly 3 inches. The constant passive-aggressive letters and threats of fines had driven me nearly insane. So, when I found a rustic log cabin on 10 acres of wooded land near a quiet lake, I bought it without a second thought. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. No HOA, no board members, no Karen with a clipboard telling me my porch light was too bright. It was just me, my cabin, and the quiet hum of nature. At least, that's what I thought when I first moved in. Life out there was simple. I woke up to the sound of birds and the smell of pine, brewed my coffee on an old iron stove, and spent my mornings working remotely from the small study I had converted into an office. In the afternoons, I'd work on repairing the cabin, replacing old window frames, restaining the deck, and chopping firewood for the long winters. It was exactly the kind of peace I had craved for so long. Occasionally, I'd invite my cousin, Mark, to come stay with me for a few days. Mark wasn't just any cousin, he was a county judge. Tough as nails, sharp as a blade, and not the type of man who tolerated nonsense from anyone. Whenever he came over, we'd sit on the porch with a couple of beers and watch the sun go down over the treeline, talking about life and laughing about the ridiculous cases he had to deal with in court. But as much as I wanted to believe I was free from HOA tyranny, trouble has a way of finding you when you least expect it. A few months after I moved in, a group of residents from the neighboring lake community decided they didn't like me. See, my property bordered their private lake, and even though I legally owned the strip of land leading to the water, they treated it as if it was part of their exclusive neighborhood. The first encounter I had with them was almost laughable. A middle-aged woman with a sharp haircut and an even sharper attitude marched right up to my porch one Saturday morning while I was splitting logs. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't even say good morning. She just demanded to know why I was trespassing near their lake. When I calmly explained that I owned this property and showed her my deed, she rolled her eyes and muttered something about checking with the HOA. That's when I realized she was the kind of person who thrived on drama, who lived to control others, who believed that her HOA had power over the entire county. Her name was Karen, of course it was. Within weeks, she had assembled a small army of clipboard warriors who began harassing me in every way they could. They left notes on my gate claiming that my firewood pile was a safety hazard. They reported me to the county for improper land use. They even tried to block my access road by parking golf carts across it. What they didn't know was that I had already built a good relationship with the local sheriff's department, and more importantly, my cousin Mark wasn't just any judge, he was the judge who signed most of their HOA's enforcement orders. If they thought they could intimidate me into submission, they had picked the wrong cabin to mess with. Things came to a head one rainy Friday night. Mark had come over for the weekend to relax after a particularly rough case involving a property dispute, which, ironically, made this whole situation even funnier to him. We had just finished dinner when the dogs started barking. At first, I thought it was just a raccoon or maybe a deer wandering too close to the porch, but then I heard the distinct sound of a door handle rattling. My cabin had a heavy oak door with a wrought iron latch, so whoever was trying to get in was struggling against it. Mark gave me a look, that calm but dangerous look that meant he was already thinking 10 steps ahead. I grabbed my flashlight and my shotgun, and we both moved quietly toward the living room. The rain was coming down hard outside, and through the window, I could make out a figure in a raincoat standing on my porch. When I swung open the door, what I saw made my blood boil. Karen, soaked to the bone, hair plastered to her face, holding a crowbar in one hand and looking like she had just been caught red-handed. She froze when she saw me standing there with the shotgun, and before she could even open her mouth, Mark stepped forward from the shadows, his judge's voice cutting through the rain like a knife. "Ma'am, you just committed breaking and entering," he said, his tone calm but deadly serious. Karen's face went pale. Karen stumbled back a step when she saw Mark, almost dropping the crowbar in her hand. The rain poured down around her, soaking her through and making the moment feel like something out of a crime drama. For a second, she looked less like a self-appointed neighborhood queen and more like a cornered animal. But the thing about people like Karen is that they rarely back down completely, their pride won't let them. Even caught in the act, she tried to spin the situation in her favor. "This cabin is in violation of several HOA rules," she shouted over the thunder, her voice shrill and shaking. "Your fire pit is illegal, your lighting is disturbing the peace, and you've been seen trespassing on HOA property." I couldn't help it, I laughed. Out loud. The absurdity of hearing the words, HOA rules, while standing on land that wasn't even part of their jurisdiction made something in me snap. "Karen," I said, stepping closer, "this is my property. You are trespassing. And that," I pointed at the crowbar, "is evidence of attempted burglary. You just tried to break into my home." Mark took a step forward, his boots squelching on the wet porch. "I'm Judge Mark Callahan, County Court," he said, pulling out his badge case and flipping it open just long enough for her to see. "Ma'am, I strongly suggest you put that crowbar down and step away from the door. Right now." For once, Karen seemed at a loss for words. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But, true to form, she quickly found her indignation again. "You can't talk to me like that. I'm the head of the HOA board." "Ma'am," Mark said with the patience of a man who had dealt with far worse in courtrooms, "an HOA board does not have legal jurisdiction over private property outside of its recorded subdivision. You know that. And if you don't, you're about to learn, the hard way. I am advising you right now that you are trespassing and have committed a crime. Go back to your car, leave this property, and consider yourself lucky if we don't call the sheriff." Karen glared at him, then at me, then at the cabin behind us as if still hoping she could somehow claim it was hers by sheer force of will. Finally, with a dramatic huff, she threw the crowbar onto the porch with a loud clatter, turned on her heel, and stomped back down the steps toward the road where her SUV was parked. The red taillights disappeared into the storm a minute later, leaving Mark and me standing there in stunned silence, the rain washing away the mud on the porch. When we got back inside, Mark shook his head and let out a low whistle. "She's going to be back," he said matter-of-factly, wiping water off his jacket. "People like her don't just quit. This is going to get uglier before it gets better." He was right. The next morning, we woke up to find that someone had dumped a pile of HOA violation notices all over my driveway. They were ridiculous. Complaints about unapproved roofing materials, improper deck staining, and even a failure to comply with community aesthetic standards. It would have been funny if it weren't so invasive. Mark took one look at them, folded his arms, and said, "All right. She wants to play games? We'll play games, legally." That day, we drove into town and paid a visit to the county recorder's office. We pulled every single property record, easement, and plat map for my land and the surrounding parcels. Mark wanted to make absolutely sure there was no gray area Karen could use against me. What we found was even better than I expected. Not only was my property completely outside of their HOA, but I also owned the only legal easement to the lake from the north side. Technically, their residents had been crossing my land for years to access a small trail, meaning they had been trespassing on me. Mark grinned when he saw the paperwork. This is open and shut. If she pushes this any further, she's going to be standing in front of my bench before the month is out. Sure enough, Karen escalated things the following week. She showed up again, this time with 2 other board members, all of them wearing matching raincoats like they were on some kind of mission from the HOA gods. They parked on the edge of my driveway and started snapping photos of my cabin, my truck, and even the firewood stacked neatly by the shed. Mark was there again. He had stayed the whole week, partly for backup and partly because he said he was curious to see how far they'd go. We stepped outside together, and this time I recorded everything on my phone. "Karen, you're trespassing again," I said calmly as we approached. "You need to leave." "This is an inspection," she said coldly, her clipboard in hand. "You are out of compliance with our regulations, and if you do not make the necessary changes, you will be fined." Mark stepped forward and pulled out the certified property map we had picked up from the county office. "This is not your jurisdiction," he said. "You have no legal authority here. If you or your associate step foot on this property again without permission, we will have you arrested for criminal trespass." One of the men with her shifted uncomfortably and muttered something under his breath. Karen's face turned red. She tried to argue, throwing out words like community standards and home values, but Mark didn't budge. "Ma'am, I'm giving you a lawful warning right now. Leave before I call the sheriff." Eventually, they backed down and got into their SUV, glaring at us as they drove away. Mark turned to me, his expression serious. "You should get cameras up, every angle. Document everything. If she tries anything again, we'll have her in court so fast she won't know what hit her." I nodded. I wasn't just protecting my cabin anymore, I was preparing for war. Mark wasn't joking when he said to prepare for war. By the following weekend, my cabin looked like a fortress, or at least, as close to one as a log cabin could get. I had installed motion-activated cameras around the perimeter, 2 floodlights over the driveway, and even a trail cam hidden in the woods near the easement path. If Karen so much as set foot on my land, I'd have it all on video. Mark helped me set up a secure cloud backup system so that even if someone tried to destroy the cameras, the footage would still be saved. For a few days, things were quiet. Too quiet. It was the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up, because you knew it couldn't last. Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds and go home. She was plotting, and I could feel it. Mark stayed at the cabin, working remotely from my small office during the day, occasionally teasing me about how we were running a full-scale surveillance operation out of a one-room study. Better safe than sorry, I told him. Then, late one night, we got our first hit. The camera sent an alert to my phone around 1:30 a.m., movement detected near the wood line. I pulled up the live feed and saw 2 figures in dark clothing moving along the edge of my property. They were carrying something, long objects that glinted in the moonlight. Mark was instantly alert. He grabbed his boots, holstered his sidearm, and nodded at me to follow. We moved quietly out the back door, using the cover of darkness to approach from the side. When we got close enough to see them clearly, my blood boiled. It was Karen and one of her board members, and they were hammering something into the ground, wooden stakes with little, "No trespassing, HOA property" signs. They were literally trying to claim my land in the middle of the night. Mark didn't hesitate. He stepped out of the shadows, flashlight in one hand and badge in the other. "Freeze," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had spent years in a courtroom. The beam of his flashlight landed squarely on Karen, who let out a startled yelp and dropped her hammer. "You again?" Mark said, his voice icy. "This is now the 3rd time I've caught you trespassing on private property. And this time, you're posting false signage to misrepresent legal ownership. Do you have any idea how serious that is? Karen stammered, trying to regain her composure. This land belongs to the HOA, she insisted, though her voice wavered. I have a right to enforce community standards. No, Mark said firmly, pulling a folded document from his jacket pocket. It was a certified copy of my deed and the county map. This is legally recorded county property, belonging to my cousin. You are committing criminal trespass and property vandalism right now. And since you are using false signage to intimidate a property owner, you may also be looking at charges for harassment and fraud. The board member with her turned pale. Karen, maybe we should go, he said nervously. But Karen, true to her nature, doubled down. You can't intimidate me with your fake authority, she snapped. This whole thing is going to be brought before the HOA board, and you'll regret treating me this way. That was the last straw. Mark pulled out his phone, called the sheriff's department, and reported an active trespassing and vandalism incident. Within 15 minutes, 2 deputies rolled up the gravel road with their lights on. The look on Karen's face when they stepped out of the cruiser was priceless. The deputies were polite but firm. They took statements, reviewed the footage from my cameras, and photographed the signs Karen had been posting. One of them even chuckled under his breath when he saw the HOA logo printed on them. Ma'am, you can't just go around putting up fake property signs, he said, shaking his head. This isn't your jurisdiction. You're lucky the judge here caught you before you went any further. Karen was issued a formal trespass warning and told that if she returned to my property without permission, she would be arrested. She tried to argue, but the deputy shut her down quickly. Ma'am, this isn't an HOA meeting. This is law enforcement. You need to leave before you make this worse for yourself. When the cruisers finally pulled away, Karen was fuming. I half expected her SUV to peel out and spray gravel across my driveway, but she drove off slowly, probably already planning her next move. The next morning, Mark and I reviewed the footage again over coffee. She's rattled, he said. But I don't think she's done. People like her don't stop until they hit a wall they can't get around. And sure enough, 2 days later, I got a letter in the mail, a formal HOA citation, fining me $5,000 for violations of Community Covenant 12B. I almost laughed myself off the porch when I read it. The letter was full of legal-sounding jargon but had no actual authority over me. Mark took one look at it and shook his head. This is intimidation, plain and simple. We're taking this to court. He spent the next 3 days drafting a legal complaint on my behalf. Because he couldn't represent me personally in his own court, conflict of interest, he called in a favor from one of his attorney friends who specialized in property disputes. Together, they built a rock-solid case, trespassing, harassment, attempted fraud, and even potential civil damages for emotional distress. By the time we filed the paperwork, Karen and her HOA board were facing a very real lawsuit. Word spread fast through the lake community. I started getting emails from some of the quieter residents, people who were fed up with Karen's leadership and wanted me to know they supported me. A few even admitted they had been afraid to speak up because Karen threatened to fine them or report them for every little thing. It turned out I wasn't the only one she had been bullying. Mark smirked when I told him. Good, he said. That means we're not just fighting for you, we're fighting for everyone she's been stepping on. This is bigger than just your cabin now. The day we filed the lawsuit was the day everything shifted. Until then, Karen had treated this like a power game, a contest of wills between the HOA board president and some outsider who didn't respect her imaginary authority. But lawsuits aren't HOA violation letters. They're real, tangible consequences, and when the sheriff's office served her with the papers, her smug smile finally began to crack. Mark's friend, attorney Thomas Reynolds, was the perfect man for the job, calm, experienced, and with a reputation for dismantling overreaching HOA boards. He came to the cabin that night to go over strategy. The wood stove crackled as we sat at the table surrounded by stacks of evidence, copies of my deed, video stills from the cameras, written witness statements from neighbors, and every single bogus citation Karen had sent me. "This is about as clear-cut as it gets," Thomas said, tapping one of the folders. "We're going to argue criminal trespass, harassment, and request a permanent injunction to bar the HOA from contacting you again. With the video evidence and the sheriff's report, we're in a very strong position." Mark nodded in agreement. "And if she tries to drag this into my courtroom, I'll make sure it's reassigned so it stays clean. But believe me, every judge in this county knows how to handle HOA overreach." In the days leading up to the hearing, Karen went into overdrive. Flyers started appearing around the lake community, accusing me of being a danger to property values, and claiming I was trying to steal access to the lake from paying residents. She even held a so-called emergency HOA meeting, where she stood at the front of the clubhouse and ranted for nearly an hour about how I was threatening their way of life. But something unexpected happened. People stopped listening. The more she shouted, the more the other residents began to realize how far off the deep end she had gone. A neighbor named Greg, who had lived there for 20 years, actually came to my cabin one afternoon and apologized. "Look," he said, nervously holding his hat in his hands, "I didn't want to get involved before, but Karen's out of control. She fined me for leaving my kayak out overnight, and now she's trying to run you off land that isn't even hers. That's not what this community is supposed to be about." I thanked him and told him he wasn't alone. Several other neighbors had already signed sworn statements about Karen's behavior. When Mark heard about it, he smiled. "This is what we wanted," he said. "The more reasonable people in that HOA realize she's a liability, the better your case looks." Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. The courthouse was packed. Apparently word had spread, and half the lake community had shown up to watch. Thomas and I sat at the plaintiff's table, and across the aisle, Karen sat stiffly in a navy blazer, her arms crossed, glaring daggers at me. She had hired an attorney of her own, but even from across the room, I could tell he looked uncomfortable. The judge assigned to the case was not Mark, as promised. He had recused himself, but Judge Helen Saunders, a no-nonsense woman who had a reputation for not tolerating petty squabbles. She read through the case file carefully before looking up at Karen. "Mrs. Langley," she said, her voice even, "I have reviewed the deeds, maps, and legal filings. This property is not under your HOA's jurisdiction. That is not up for debate. What is up for debate is whether your repeated presence on this property and the citations you issued rise to the level of harassment. Do you understand what that means?" Karen tried to launch into a speech about community integrity and protecting the lake, but Judge Saunders held up a hand. "This is a court of law, not an HOA board meeting. You will answer the question." From there, Thomas methodically laid out our case. He presented the footage of Karen attempting to break into my cabin, the sheriff's reports, the photographs of the fake HOA signs, and the threatening letters she had left in my driveway. Each piece of evidence made Karen squirm a little more in her seat. The moment the video of her with the crowbar played on the screen, there was an audible gasp from the spectators. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she tried to spin the narrative, claiming that she had only been trying to inspect the property for safety reasons and that I was endangering the neighborhood. But under cross-examination, Thomas dismantled her story piece by piece. He got her to admit that she had no legal authority over my property, no documented safety violations, and no permission to be on my land. By the time closing arguments were over, the energy in the courtroom had shifted entirely. The spectators, who had come expecting a neighborly dispute, now saw clearly that this was harassment. Judge Saunders returned with her ruling after a brief recess. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff," she said. "The defendant, Mrs. Langley, is hereby ordered to cease all contact with the plaintiff and is permanently barred from entering his property. Furthermore, the HOA is fined for harassment, and damages in the amount of $15,000 are awarded to the plaintiff." Karen's jaw dropped. The color drained from her face. Her attorney leaned over and whispered something to her, probably about how appealing the decision would only cost her more money. But the real blow came after court, when Mark, who had been sitting quietly in the gallery, finally walked up to her. He didn't gloat, he didn't have to. "Mrs. Langley," he said calmly, "you should consider yourself lucky this didn't turn criminal. If I catch you violating this order, I won't hesitate to sign the warrant myself." Karen didn't say a word. She just turned and walked out of the courthouse, shoulders stiff, her little entourage trailing behind her like defeated soldiers. When the gavel came down and the case was officially closed, I felt a wave of relief wash over me that I hadn't realized I'd been holding back. For months, Karen had turned my quiet retreat into a battlefield, but now, with the court's ruling, I finally had the law on my side, not just in theory, but in writing. The permanent injunction meant she couldn't set foot on my property again, couldn't send me letters, couldn't find me, couldn't so much as leave a sticky note on my gate without risking arrest. It was a victory, and for the first time since buying the cabin, I felt like I could actually breathe. But the story didn't end there, not by a long shot. Within weeks, the ripple effects of the case started shaking the HOA to its core. Word spread quickly that their fearless leader had lost a major lawsuit and cost the HOA $15,000 in damages. That money had to come from somewhere, and when the board tried to pass a special assessment to cover it, the residents erupted. People who had once been too afraid to speak up were suddenly standing on chairs in meetings, demanding Karen's resignation. They were furious that their dues were being spent on what they called Karen's personal vendetta. Eventually, a petition to recall her as HOA president gained overwhelming support. At the next board election, Karen and two of her closest allies were voted out by a landslide. The new board, led by a much calmer, level-headed neighbor named Greg, the same man who had come to my cabin to apologize, immediately set about undoing some of Karen's more oppressive policies. They rolled back several petty regulations, reduced fines, and even sent me a formal letter apologizing for the harassment I'd endured. But Karen didn't go quietly. For months afterward, I'd hear rumors through the grapevine that she was trying to rally support for a comeback, writing angry posts in the community Facebook group, and even attempting to sue the new board for defamation. None of it went anywhere. The legal ruling had been too clear, and most of her former supporters had grown tired of the drama. Meanwhile, my life at the cabin finally became what I had always dreamed it would be. The nights were quiet again, no headlights pulling into my driveway, no strangers snapping photos of my property, no piles of fake violations showing up on my doorstep. I spent my mornings fishing off the lake dock, afternoons working on the cabin, and evenings sitting on the porch with Mark when he visited, both of us laughing about how this little cabin dispute had turned into one of the most satisfying legal victories of our lives. One weekend, Greg and a few other neighbors came over with beer and barbecue as a kind of peace offering. They thanked me for standing up to Karen, saying it had given them the courage to push back against her as well. "You didn't just win for yourself," Greg told me, raising his glass. "You won for everyone she bullied." Mark, sitting next to me, nodded. "You set a precedent," he said. "This is going to make every HOA board in the county think twice before trying something like this again." That night, after everyone had gone home and the crickets had begun their usual chorus in the woods, I sat on the porch alone for a while, just listening. The rain from earlier in the week had left the air cool and fresh, and the stars were so bright they looked like pinpricks in the black velvet sky. I thought about how close I had come to losing this peace, how easily Karen could have driven me away if I hadn't fought back. But I had fought back. And in the end, it wasn't just me who won, it was every quiet neighbor who just wanted to live in peace, every family tired of being fined for trivial nonsense, every property owner who had ever been pushed around by someone drunk on power. The cabin stood there in the moonlight, solid and unshaken, just like it had when I first bought it. It felt different now, not just a retreat, but a fortress of freedom, a place that no HOA, no clipboard-wielding Karen, and no self-important board could ever take from me. I finally smiled to myself, leaned back in my chair, and let the quiet wrap around me like a blanket. This fight was over. My land was safe. And for the first time in months, I was exactly where I belonged.